Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to talk to another bird club about our county. Essex is a brilliant county. I've done loads of birding in Essex over the years, seen some good rarities in Essex. But Hampshire is where I do all my main UK birding now. And yeah, I can update you on the world list. I'm up to 8,888 as of last week. I got back from a trip to Brazil. And next year I should get to 9,000, which not many people have done, so that'll be a really special moment. So I'm going to talk about the state of Hampshire's birds, how they're doing, what we're seeing, and give you an idea as to, the history of birding in Hampshire too. And like Essex, we have a long history of bird watching and bird recording. And of course, if you've got a set of the Essex bird reports going back, you'll recognize that over the years, they've all become much brighter and prettier and better produced. Here we are in Hampshire back in 1965 with one of the early bird reports. Back before that, they used to be mixed in with all the other wildlife, so there wasn't a distinct bird report. But you can see over the years it's improved, it's become brighter and better produced. Quick example, go back to 2001. We had 249 species, there were 316 observers, and there were 31,000 records. If we move forward now to just a recent one, we've just published our 23 report, but here's the one for 22. And you can see same sort of number of birds, slightly more things like little egrets and great egrets and so on. But look at the number of observers, 2,300 and 450,000 records. Well, actually in the 23 report, we even eclipsed that and went over 500,000. So actually, it really has changed. Online recording of birds has gone through the roof. I think bird watching itself has become incredibly common and popular now. A lot of the people who are birding are very new to it. And I think as bird clubs, one of the things we have a real responsibility to do is to help those people get up to speed pretty quickly with watching birds. And we indeed run training courses in HOS to encourage those people to learn more. In fact, they pay for those training courses and we run them throughout the spring. We run birdsong courses and so on. Anyway, enough about HOS, but as you can see, Hampshire's busy. And, just look at that number of observers. It must have been amazing to be the county recorder back in 1950. 50 observers submitting records, probably all of them on postcards. And I'm sure the county recorder knew all of them on first name terms. Well, I was the county recorder in Hampshire between about 2010 and 2023, and my goodness me, it just has snowballed. I know a fraction of the people who submit records now. So how many birds have we got? Well, we've got just under 400 in Hampshire, and that's made up of 110 residents, 48 winter visitors, 28 summer visitors, these are breeders of course, 26 that are passage migrants just passing through on their way to somewhere else. And like Essex, we're good for rarities. We've got a good coastline, so we have 175 birds that are rare, hardly ever turn up. And that is a very large number. I would never have expected it to be more than the number of resident birds. Well, gone. So these are all birds that had gone when I prepared this talk 2 years ago. But amazingly, Dipper came back in 2022, as you'll have seen from the front of that bird report, and bred actually in the middle of Romsey in the town park, right in front of where everybody goes for their Sunday walk. So you couldn't keep that quiet. And also Wheatear nested for the first time this summer. And indeed we had roseate tern, but they never left us. They just kind of came and went all the time. But all the others have gone. So amazingly, we did have black grouse up until the 1920s. I think it must have been a wealthy landowner near to the New Forest that thought it would be fun to have black grouse to shoot in addition to pheasants. But they went 100 years ago. And we've got others that are declining. So these are all still with us. All of them pretty much still breeding. Let me define that. Willow tit, I don't think is actually present in the county at all now. We had 2 or 3 pairs and they all just vanished, but more about that later. Redpoll, as we must call it now. Actually, I don't think it's bred or been proved to breed for about 20 years, but they are still around. and all the others are, as we know, declining. And the same will be true in Essex and other counties in the south. But, 1960 was a big year for me. It's the year I appeared on the planet. And since that time, all these birds have started to nest in Hampshire on a regular basis since that time. So all familiar examples of birds that have moved in, and you'll be seeing that as well. We haven't yet got breeding great egret, but I'm sure it's going to happen, and I expect we'll get spoonbills and glossy ibis eventually. We've got enough of them. So I thought I'd have just look through some of the birds in the order I found them there that I think are interesting. And of course, little egrets arrived. We all had them arrive back in the late 80s, and this is a quick grab of a picture in British Birds magazine shortly after people got excited about them in about 2010, and you can see the rapid increase through from the late 90s. And of course, it's gone beyond that now. I think it's plateaued a bit, but we definitely have them nesting in a few places. And you can see here's the BTO atlas on the right showing the distribution of little egret, and on the left you've got the Hampshire bird atlas, just giving you an idea of the density and where they are. And of course, they're very much on the coast, but you can also see they very much follow the river valleys in Hampshire. We've got some great rivers, and they're really nice fishing rivers like the River Test. And that's where they're found. We've got about 5 colonies. Mostly they're nesting in amongst with grey herons, and you can see them going to roost every evening. We have roosts of over 100 little egrets in a couple of places. The nests are pretty flimsy. If you've never seen a little egret nest, well, I can tell you it's not much more than a wood pigeon would put up into a tree, and you can see through it. But they very often like to nest, nearly always actually, with grey herons, and they allow the grey herons to have the upper story, the sort of penthouse suite, and the little egrets go in just one floor down. And that's because the grey herons provide really good cover protection from things like buzzards and crows that do hang around heronries and try and grab the odd chick. It's a good strategy, but it's not totally successful because unfortunately the grey herons start nesting early and the little egrets start late. And so when the little egrets probably need those herons most of all, they've actually gone. And there's a little egret nest. As you can see, quite a flimsy affair. And last year we had some pretty bad storms in March, just ahead of the breeding season. A lot of the nests were destroyed. So last year was a blank year for some little egrets. They just didn't have time to rebuild the nest. We do have cattle egret now. Cattle egrets came and started nesting 3-4 years ago. They first moved in, actually tried to shack up with little egrets. We had some male cattle egrets that came in and started wooing the female little egrets, but it didn't really work. And in the end, they got their own females. And now we have something in the region of about 10 or so pairs. It's not very large, but I guess it will become larger in time. And there's a flock of cattle egrets passing over, grabbed by a friend of mine. An amazing shot. He thought they were going to be little egrets, but they were indeed cattle. And this just gives you an idea of where little egrets have been seen. Sorry, cattle egrets have been seen. That's just sort of a recent grab off bird guides, and you can see they are very much spread around the south, and a lot more of them to come, I'm pretty sure. And the same is true of great white egret. Now, we were one of the first counties, I think, to have a regular great white egret. Here he is. This is Walter. Walter appeared, I think, in around about 2000, and Walter had all these colorings on, and we managed to track him down to being a male that was ringed in the nest in Brittany. And he was with us every single winter for about, I'm going to say 15 years at least. But the weird thing is, he disappeared every summer. So we have no idea where he went, because given that he's got all these colorings, somebody somewhere would spot him if he was around, but he wasn't noted. I have no idea where he went. Might have gone back to France, who knows? But he wasn't in Hampshire, that's for sure. Plenty of bird watchers looking for him. And they live alongside the little egrets, if you've ever wondered the size difference between the two, well, obviously the great egret's a bit closer to the camera here, but it is a big bird with a huge beak. The beak is nearly always yellow, excepting sometimes in the breeding season when it does turn dark. And they don't have yellow feet, which is something which little egrets nearly always do have. And here's an example of recent sightings of great egrets, or great white egret, as I could call it. In fact, I was down in Somerset at last weekend. I called in at Chew Valley Lake. I think I saw 15 just in one lake. So there's loads around. And there are loads of spoonbills too. And we find we get a lot of spoonbills in the winter. They are actually Dutch birds in their first year, nearly always. And excuse me, some of them are colour ringed, so we know we're from Holland. And here are some young ones with a bit of black on the edge of the wings. So they are mainly young birds, and there's quite a lot also further west in Poole Harbour in Dorset, and here they are flying off with the black wingtips showing, which indicates that they are young birds. So they're going to nest at some point. I'm quite sure of that. They're nesting in Britain already. It's just a matter of time until these birds nest, as is the case also with probably night heron, I imagine, as well. Well, one bird we probably don't really appreciate having and enjoy having is Egyptian goose, which was brought to Britain by a wealthy landowner in Norfolk, I think 100 and something years ago, up at Holcombe Hall. And they spread from there. As you can see, they spread all over East Anglia. I'm sure you're fed up with them already as well. That map is from the Atlas, which is obviously now quite old, BTO Atlas. Let's just move it forward. You can see in Hampshire, they were just up in the northeast of Hampshire, but here's a recent download of data I've just put together, and you can see they are really spreading. We see a lot of them. We've had flocks of over 100. Not a popular bird. But if I'd said to you, think about a bird that nests in Hampshire, but nowhere else in southern England, I don't think you'd have thought of eider. We have one pair of eiders. They nest every year, and we found them because the warden of a nature reserve spotted the nest with all the lovely feathers. There were no eggs in the nest. They'd already hatched or been predated, but that was found, and then the next year they managed to find a female with the chicks. And they nest every year. It's the only nest in southern England, and you can actually see it on the BTO map there. One dot right down the bottom, just above the Isle of Wight. So the others the nearest ones are actually in Wales and around Manchester and so on, and Lancashire. So quite an unusual one. But it's not the only bird to be found in Hampshire that perhaps you wouldn't expect. Would you have expected goosander to be nesting? I would have thought of goosander as being on Dartmoor or in Wales or Scotland or something like that. But we have goosanders now nesting in hollow trees on the side of the River Avon. And that's the river which is on the border between Hampshire and Dorset and Wiltshire. And again, if you look at this BTO map, you can see just to the west of the Isle of Wight, those three red dots indicating breeding up the River Avon. So quite unusual. And the nearest ones, as I said, are down in Devon. So a bit of a surprise there. Maybe they'll be coming to Essex soon, who knows? But a bird that we do have, and I know you've had a few of our birds too, is the white-tailed eagle. I sit on the white-tailed eagle reintroduction steering group, and it's been a fascinating project since 2019, bringing young eagles, only a few weeks old, from Scotland, various parts of Scotland, never bringing two from the same nest, just bringing one, and then allowing them to grow in captivity. And here is on the right-hand side, Roy Dennis, who I'm sure you know of, but if you don't, he's an absolute legend. He was the RSPB Highlands officer when I was a teenage birder, and he's still going strong in his 80s. So Roy is behind the project, and the team he's with are the team that check out these eagles. The vet is the next guy, and then there's Tim McCrill, who's well known for his work on ospreys and eagles, and also Steve Edgerton-Reed. So there's an eagle ready to be released. They have their cages on the Isle of Wight where they are released. So they're not actually released in Hampshire. And they go out from there with trackers on, both a satellite tracker, which tells people well, tells us within meters where the bird is, and then also a different kind of tracker, which is a transmitter sending out a radio signal just in case the satellite tracker fails to work. Now, the maps we've got are amazing, but here's just a quick example. Here are 4 different eagles released in the same year, and here's where they all went to from the Isle of Wight. And you know, they quite often all go up to Scotland at some point, and they go to Kent. I know they've been in Essex, and they've also been to Europe. So we've already now got a pair of eagles nesting in Sussex. They've nested twice, and we've got 2 other pairs of eagles that have paired up, having been released, and we're hoping that they will nest as well. They've certainly made practice nests. And one of the things we know they do is that they actually follow kites. Kites are incredibly good at finding things like dead pheasants and dead rabbits on the farms where they haven't been picked up after a shoot. And the eagles come in and they steal the kite's food. So kites don't like them very much. Sadly, though, we've had a few killed from rat poison. I'm afraid almost certainly rat poison put down intentionally with the purpose of killing raptors, maybe not trying to kill an eagle, but trying to get rid of buzzards, perhaps. And, you know, an eagle just recently died and it had rat poison in its system, 3 times the amount that it was actually required to kill it. And this is something that needs to be outlawed. The police are aware of it. Very sadly, the first one of these that died was in Dorset, and the local member of parliament made a fuss about it, and the whole story just went away. Well, the good news is that MP's gone away now because he wasn't re-elected. So hopefully eagles are going to have a better time in Dorset going forward. As I mentioned, the red kite is a bird that they follow, and we have lots of them now. I've studied them quite intensively, and I reckon there's about 500 pairs of red kites in Hampshire. The number's pretty level. It doesn't go up much, but it's not been going down, really. It's just stayed level or gone up. If we go back to when I was a lad, then they were just in Wales. The only place they were found, and there's 30 or 40 pairs all breeding with each other, so a lot of inbreeding, not great for the gene pool. Then the release happened in the late 1980s and the early 90s, and the release of young birds brought from Spain meant that these grew up and started breeding. And indeed, they mixed in with the Welsh ones, they mixed with themselves. So all the red kites you ever see in Essex are going to be birds that will have come from Spanish stock originally. Here's the Hampshire map going back to the last BTO Atlas. The next BTO Atlas is coming up in about 2027, so it's not long away. And when we do that, I think the whole of that map's going to be green. There won't be any spaces. And we have between 400 and 500 in roosts in the winter. Now, roosts are made up of young birds born either this year or last year. So in other words, they're not yet ready to breed, but they are looking for a mate. And you get a few adults in those roosts as well, but they will always be the ones that have lost a partner. So that's a good way of getting an idea of numbers too. And I did notice after 2020 that the numbers did decline for a year or so. Most of our kites are relying really heavily on roadkill. And of course, during the lockdown time, there was no traffic. So we had rabbits and squirrels pretty much playing football in the middle of the M3 motorway. You know, it was a time when hardly any animals got killed on the roads. And so the kites went hungry and their numbers declined. They didn't breed very much that year. We do have a lot of goshawks, and I think you'll be astonished at how many goshawks we have. We reckon now probably about 180 pairs of goshawks, and these are all emanating from the New Forest. The first ones in the New Forest were actually only at the beginning of the 2000s, and bit by bit, you know, it went from 1 pair to 2 to 4 to 8, 16, and so on. We now have about 45 territories within the New Forest, and of course they're all rearing 2 or 3 chicks each year, and they head out, and therefore they're setting up home in other woods. If you find an area of woodland, maybe it could be deciduous woodland, but with a block of conifer in the middle of it, it doesn't need to be big. It could be sort of like 200 meters by 200 meter block. quite often you'll get a goshawk pair in that block. And I'm finding goshawks in pretty much any big piece of woodland in Hampshire now. Here they are nationally. You can see the rill on the left-hand map. That area of density is the New Forest. And of course, we're talking a long time ago, 2008 to 2011. Well, already they were doing well. And you can see on the UK map where Hampshire is, and you can see they're spreading up towards Dorset as well. Well, I did a bit of data looking, and I took every 10k square in Hampshire, and just in 1 year, last year, to see if there were goshawks in any of those 10 km squares. Well, every one of those dots represents a 10 km square. There's hardly any areas in Hampshire which don't have at least some goshawks. And they are the supreme predator. They have an impact on other birds. There's no doubt about it. You can't escape from this. You'll notice if you get goshawks that you'll see fewer sparrowhawks. So we do a survey every month in the New Forest with 35 different transects, and we know that we now see more goshawks than sparrowhawks. So I don't know whether they just kill the sparrowhawks or whether the sparrowhawks simply choose to move somewhere else, maybe move away from the New Forest. We've certainly noticed the number of hobbies went down for a bit, but they seem to have built up again. And it may well be that hobbies have learnt that rather than living in the pine woods with the goshawk, which is not a great move, you're better off out on the open heath, maybe on an isolated pine or a group of pines, somewhere where perhaps the goshawk is not so likely to go. And if you've never found a goshawk nest, well, here it is. It's huge. Someone said to me, tell me what the difference is between a sparrowhawk nest and a goshawk nest. Well, sparrowhawk nest, you'd fall through it. A goshawk nest, you could sit up there with a friend and have a party. It is huge. Now, people do come to Hampshire to look for honey buzzards. It has always been well known that we have a population of honey buzzards in the New Forest, but the truth is they're much more widespread than just that. There might be 4 or 5 pairs in the New Forest, but outside the New Forest, there's probably as many again, dotted around Hampshire. And if you go to, for example, Dorset to the west and Sussex to the east, well, I would argue they seem to have even more than us. They may just have better viewing points, actually, because they have the South Downs, which they can watch from. But honey buzzards are definitely around. This is a male with the grey head. Here's the UK distribution of honey buzzards. As you can see, it's obviously mapped very carefully and privately so that nobody can go and disturb birds. This is one of the best viewpoints if you ever want to see, actually goshawks and honey buzzards. And that is Acres Down, which is in the New Forest, not too far from Lyndhurst. Just sit on Acres Down on a nice day, maybe the end of May, or maybe the end of July, and you've got a very good chance of seeing honey buzzard. The time when you won't see them actually is during June. Absolutely impossible to see honey buzzards at that time unless you know exactly where they're going to nest. They nest very late. The chicks are in the nest in July and August. So that's when they're busy bringing food. So you won't find them very much in June. Look for something else. And I'm quite often asked, what's the difference between a buzzard and a honey buzzard? Well, here's common buzzard on the left, and here's a honey buzzard on the right. And there really is a big difference. It's a very slender bird, perhaps more like a kite in its shape, much lighter body. I've held babies, they're much lighter than baby buzzards, calmer as well. So here's a couple of common buzzards flying around. You can see reasonably short, stubby wings, and then all of the birds in these photos here, these are all honey buzzards. Long wings, long tail. Quite often you can see the bars on the tail, but look at the variation in the plumage. Look at those birds on the left. Those are young birds, by the way, as are the two on the right. Here's an adult, though. Adults have yellow eyes. Young birds have black eyes, and young birds have a different shape. They're actually structurally not as developed, and so the wings are not as long. If you see a young honey buzzard going over, you may well mistake it for a common buzzard. I've done it many times indeed. And if you were ever lucky enough to see a honey buzzard up close, well, you'd see the nostril. And you can see it's like a little slit in the top mandible, because this is a bird that digs around in wasp nests and it doesn't want wasps going up its nostril. And it's got thick feathering around the head to try and stop that from happening. So what's that? Is that a common buzzard or is that a honey buzzard? Well, that's a young honey buzzard. So you can see very similar to a common buzzard at that age. Here's one in the nest, surrounded by comb. So, they don't eat honey and they're not a buzzard. It's a pretty stupid name. But here it is, surrounded by wasp comb. So all the various wasp species, doesn't matter which one, they all make nests, they all have comb, and the honey buzzard will find those nests, break into them, not break into them straight away, or very often remember where they are and go back later when they need the wasp comb. And here's the male, here's the female. This is where, under license, we put a camera up at a nest, and it's a time-lapse camera, so it took a photograph every 5 seconds. And over a 6-hour period where the camera was in position, you were able to photograph these birds. And you can see the female at the bottom has got a colour ring on. She was actually born in Sussex, and she then came to us. Then she went to Surrey, and then she came back to us again. And she became the oldest known honey buzzard in Britain. In fact, I think still the oldest. We haven't seen her for the last 3-4 years, so I imagine she's gone. And as I say, they feed on wasp comb. But the one thing you wouldn't have expected is that they also feed on frogs. And they find frogs and they find toads on the floor of the forest as they're walking around looking for wasp nests. They've got flat feet, rather like chickens. It enables them to walk quite easily. You wouldn't see a buzzard walking like this. And they're quietly walking around and they're finding things like frogs and they bring them back to the nest. Quite possibly the chicks eat more frogs than wasps. Now, peregrine is one of my study species. Of course, you have them as well. And like Hampshire, Essex has got a good coastline, so there are plenty of places where they can nest. Back in the first BTO atlas, they'd vanished. They'd been pushed away through pesticides, egg collecting, and also they'd been shot during the Second World War. But the great news is that when we got around to the third atlas, things had really changed. And as you can see, numbers had increased. Every single red triangle there is where a peregrine had moved back into. And there in detail is where they'd moved back in. And you can see in 2000, they started nesting in Essex. They'd started in Hampshire in 1993. And here's the number of nests. You can see it was very slow to take off. And after about 15 years or so, the acceleration did happen. But we've pretty much peaked now at about 20 to 25 nests each year. And there are limiting factors. There's only a certain number of nest sites. And there are also other threats from things like bird flu at the moment. These two maps are from the Hampshire Atlas. So on the left, you can see the summer distribution of peregrine. So very much attracted to the coast. Lots of waders, of course, all through the year on our coastline. So they like that. But on the right-hand side, you can see the winter map. And in winter, we do get continental birds, as you do in Essex. And the numbers are higher up in the north of the county, probably from those visiting birds. This is Winnie, quite a famous peregrine, actually. She was the female at Winchester Cathedral. And here she is with her partner, Chester. Winnie and Chester, good name for a Winchester pair. And we've been studying them for years. They're one of the 25 pairs, but they have an audience of about 200,000 every single year, thanks to the cameras. And we're able to watch the progress as the eggs hatch and chicks emerge and chicks eventually get airborne. Here's one peregrine getting rid of a buzzard. They don't like buzzards going anywhere near the nest site. But we've got some fascinating nests, and this is the docks at Southampton. So these cranes are huge, and not only are they huge, they're on a railway line. So if you see the yellow part at the bottom, that's actually a train that will transport the whole of the crane all the way down the quayside to wherever the ship has docked. So on that crane that you're looking at there, there's a peregrine nest, and those peregrines go up and down the railway line. It's the only mobile nest in the country. We've got some other interesting ones. So this was in 2004, where a pair nested on this massive floating crane, which is called Canute. And they nested on the top of the crane. And back in 2004, that crane was required to do a heavy lifting job down on the Isle of Wight. So you can see it left Southampton, went all the way down Southampton Water, crossed over the Solent, and went into Cowes in the Isle of Wight. And it stayed there for a few days and then came back again. And quite amazingly, the female peregrine stayed with the nest on the crane. She came off a few times for a fly around and a bit of a feed, but she then went all the way back up to Southampton. And the male was still in Southampton the whole time, making sure that nobody took his territory. So I've mentioned hobby already, and we are lucky to have quite a lot of hobbies in Hampshire. I think this is the classic bird that's under-recorded. It's such a secretive bird, so hard to find it. I mean, I would list all my hobby sightings in one summer, and it wouldn't even get into double figures, even if I'm in, quite good hobby habitat. But, we've done some work on this, and we reckon we've got something more than 150 pairs of hobbies based on the data we're receiving. And you can see from this BTO map, they're actually very widespread. I mean, look, really widespread in Essex and in Hampshire. So they're just very shy, and they're masters at being under the radar. And here is our detailed map for Hampshire. And again, you can see a bit of a concentration down in the New Forest in the southwest, a bit patchy going further north, but you can see, actually, if you look at the river valleys, you can see the numbers in the river valleys is slightly higher. And that's going to be linked to their real like of dragonflies. But this is the change map. And this is after goshawks arrived. And you can see a lot of red squares down in the New Forest. So that indicates where goshawks had come in and we'd lost our hobbies. And indeed, we may well lose them elsewhere, but you can see a few plus signs elsewhere too. So it may indicate the birds dispersing out. They very much do like river valleys. So if you are looking for them, that's where you need to go. And as I mentioned, whereas before we'd have always looked for them in big pine plantations and pine trees, here's a classic hobby nest in Hampshire now, in an oak tree, in a field, on a farm. And one of the ways you can try and get them in is to make a basket. You can take an old flower basket, or you can make a basket yourself. And they will very readily accept those. And I've got a friend who's putting them up regularly, and he's having a huge amount of success. And when they nest, we get the chicks, and there they are, being ringed. Super birds. We haven't had that many retraps, so I don't know. They maybe don't live very long. Now, the other bird I really work on a lot, and I think I've talked to you about this before, is the Stone Curlew. So a quick recap on Stone Curlew. Fabulous bird, really restricted. So we've got them. They've got them in Wiltshire, and of course they're up in Norfolk and Suffolk, and a little bit just in a few other places as well between. This is in Hampshire. They're all really up in the northwest. And there's been an interesting change in distribution. So if I look at the change, these are all mapped centrally, I should say. So there's no detail here. They're not all together in lines and blocks. But you can see a lot of red. And those are birds that basically used to nest in the Downs, but have left the Downs because the Downs are now very, very busy with tourism and people walking their dogs. And they've moved into farmland where the RSPB has put together a very good scheme of creating plots with farmers agreement where the birds come in and nest. And it has worked so incredibly well. We now have twice as many stone curlews as we ever had before. We've got about 25 pairs. And here's a nest. You can just see at the very bottom of the picture, the stone curlew eggs. They always make a little platform for them to keep them off the mud. And here's a typical stone curlew plot that we arrange with the local farmers. Now, I actually work on the RSPB stone curlew team, so it's a big, big project for me. And I spend most of my summer really looking at these birds, going out, talking to the farmers, making sure that they know what to do. They're being paid money, so they've got to listen to me. They can't just ignore my advice. They're being paid around £1,600 each to have a 2 hectare area like that, which they turn over early in the season, and then hopefully a nest will appear. But, the stone curlew sometimes nest off plot. In other words, they go to just a bit of farmed land, which has got crops in. And here's a good example. And here's a tractor that's going to go straight through the middle of that nest. And therefore, that's where the cooperation with farmers is really important. And I very rarely find a farmer who doesn't get excited about stone curlews. So they're really good with us. But with a situation like that, what am I going to do? Well, I'm allowed under my license to lift those eggs. So if I know exactly where the nest is, I can actually lift it and I can then put them straight back. And by the way, if you haven't spotted it, there's the nest. I also weigh the eggs and I measure the eggs. I did this actually on Spring Watch with Chris Packham a few years ago. And because the weight of the egg becomes less each day as the chick grows, it's actually inverse relationship, bigger chick, lighter weight. I can actually calculate how many days before they're going to hatch. And if I know that, I can tell the farmer and we can make sure that nothing happens around the nest at the time when there are likely to be chicks. And of course, when there are small chicks, there's no way the farmer's going to spot them from the cab in the tractor. Again, if you haven't spotted them, there they are. So again, I've got a license and I and my colleagues are able to pick up those chicks, just remove them from the field whilst the farmer does the job. Obviously, if it's on a farm where they're being paid to do the work already, they won't be farming this field. But they sometimes wander. Chicks can walk and they will go elsewhere. And they hide and they're very confident about their plumage. We do a lot of colour ringing. We make sure we know where they go to. Here's a pair of chicks which are rescued off a field of rape. They were hiding in that. And there's a thank you note from one of the chicks after I put some colour rings on its leg. Not very nice, I have to say. I'm not into bird poo in the way Chris Packham is, but he was pretty excited about this when I told him. And actually, I can tell you the smell is something, once you've smelt stone curlew poo, you'll never forget it. And at the end of the season, if it's all gone well, you'll see birds on your fields. We have an annual roost of stone curlews in the autumn, numbering around about 60 or 70 every year. And they fly up and they depart around about the end of October. But they've made it into November and we've actually had them back as early as February. So they're not away for long. And as you probably know, they did winter in Norfolk several years, well, about 15 years in a row, actually. And in 2018, when the beast from the east, that terrible cold spell arrived in end of March, that absolutely hammered them. And I think any stone curlew that was inclined to do a wintering spot in Norfolk was killed, and they don't winter anymore. Avocets, well, you had avocets before us, because of course they came down from Havergate Island down into Essex and made their way round to us. We've got just a few. As you can see, we're just a few dots at the very bottom end. Fabulous bird and just a delight to watch, but a nightmare at the same time, because great black-backed gulls are the real enemy in Hampshire. So we're dealing with places where we're fencing the nest sites, but we're also having to try and get rid of great black-backed gulls, and it's not easy to get a license to get rid of them, even though the avocets are much more important to us. You might not imagine what the other major challenge is with avocets, but it's actually otters. So we have a lot of otters now on our rivers, and they are going into the avocet colonies and they just clean up eggs, chicks. They don't stop. It's like having foxes in. It's really bad. And we're also lucky to have Mediterranean gulls, as I know you do too. But we got them first. First Mediterranean gulls to nest in Britain were in Hampshire in 1966 down on the Bewley estuary. Before that, we'd had a couple of mixed pairs, and then they finally got a pair of their own, and well, it's just gone crazy now. So you can see here the colonies along the south coast. They nest in all those places where there are dots on the south coast. The sightings further north are quite interesting. Those are actually birds going inland to feed, so on the downs, because they're mainly feeding on worms. One of the alarming things is that when they can't find worms because the ground is too dry, then they turn to eating the chicks of the terns that nest very close to them on the islands on the coast. So a dry summer is a bad news story for the tern chicks. But here they are, and we have them nesting in very dense colonies, really a lot. So this is not up to date, but it's still about the same number. We have just below 2,000 Mediterranean gull nests every summer on the Langston Harbour RSPB reserve. So that's on a couple of islands. Huge numbers. Not necessarily successful every year. Sometimes they don't do very well at all, but there are plenty of them around. And you can see them flying up to the South Downs. You get flocks of 100 going over. It's amazing. And the sound is just incredible too. And here they are just outside Winchester, so a long way away from the actual coast, and they've come inland to feed on flying ants. Just an amazing sign, and we get plenty of birds that are from other countries too, with colour rings on. So we know we're having birds from Poland and from Germany and other places. So roseate tern was a bit of a good news story this year. Roseate terns have nested on and off on an island off the coast, and they've nested with other terns. And this year, right in front of where the best viewing point is at Normandy Marsh, part of the key haven to Lymington Marshes, a pair nested, and here they are. They're both ringed, and they were both ringed in Ireland. And here they are with the chick, and as you can see, the breeding distribution is very patchy indeed. They've had a terrible time with bird flu further north, up at Coquet Island in Northumberland. They tried to nest a few years in Dorset, didn't try that this year. So our one pair is just about the only mainland nesting pair of roseate terns in England. I mentioned dipper, so this was a real surprise. Arriving in Romsey, I got a phone call from a birder who said to me, oh, I've just seen a dipper. And you get calls like this quite often. And given that dipper hadn't been seen in the county for 20 years, at least not regularly, I was coming up with all the sort of polite explanations that, oh, well, maybe that was a green sandpiper and so on. And then eventually they said, well, actually, we're not from here. We live in Derbyshire and we have dippers in our back garden. And that's when I realized we did have dippers in Hampshire. And they bred and they had chicks. And here's the chick. It's quite a momentous occasion. So fantastic news. I mean, here's the population map from the last atlas. And as you can see, it's all on higher land with fast flowing rivers. Nothing really near Hampshire. So they didn't nest again and they haven't been seen since. Not quite a one-off. It had nested before, but they're not going to be with us on a regular basis, sadly. Well, Cetti's warblers were another bird to arrive in Hampshire before anywhere else back in the 1960s. In fact, when they arrived, people thought they were mustached warblers. Some of the best names in British birdwatching went out on a limb and declared these were mustached warblers, went into print, and then had to do a bit of a retraction on that because Cetti's warbler they were, and they came, nested and spread, as we all know. And of course, they've spread right up through England now and into Wales. But from that map on the left, you can see they very much follow our river valleys. So we've got about 250 to 300 pairs of Cetti's warblers in Hampshire. And that's a good number. Quite hard to survey, but they are here to stay. And although we occasionally have cold winters, it doesn't really seem to affect them. So that's a bird that's definitely doing well. And sadly, ringneck parakeet is starting to do well. It's a bird we never saw. I've only seen it once in Hampshire, but there's the national map. You can see that there are none in Hampshire back at the time of the last atlas. But here's a recent map from data, and you can see they've moved in and they're all around Southampton. And, ringneck parakeet is an all or nothing species. It's either lots of them or none. So we have lots of them in Southampton. And we have good numbers of ravens. That's a bird that we never used to have. They've moved right across from the west. I remember the very first pair of ravens to nest was probably about 1998 or something like that. It was really exciting. And you can see from this map, from the BTO Atlas, just a few years later than that, they'd moved across and they've moved further east even now. So we've now got the best part of 100 pairs of ravens nesting, including about 20-25 pairs in the New Forest. On the other extreme, though, we've got grey partridge disappearing, and I'm sure you have too. It's a real red letter day if you find a grey partridge. And here's a male that was not released. It's on a farm that I know. And, well, there's the map on the right for the BTO. I bet you when we do the next atlas, it's going to look nothing like that. On the left, you've got the distribution map from Hampshire, but just look at that top map. It is absolutely, it looks like someone's murdered somebody on the top of the map. 489 squares that they have disappeared from, and only 12 that they've moved into. Grey partridge is a disaster story for us, and although there are farmers doing their best to try and keep them, I don't know what you've got to do. You've got to do a lot, and if you do it right, you can get them, but it's too much effort for most farmers, unfortunately. And I'm afraid turtle dove's another one that's heading down. We now have 3 sites for turtle dove. If we look at the atlas, well, back at the time of the atlas, although again, look at that change map, it's appalling. But we did have plenty of turtle doves still down on the South Downs, but they have gone. And every year I just wonder if it's the last year for turtle dove in Hampshire. There's loads of habitat. They should be there. There must be other reasons. It's not just going to be down to British habitat, that's for sure. And similarly, wood warblers. You know, why are we not having wood warblers now? We've got a few. We've got about half a dozen pairs. That's all. When I was a kid, the New Forest was stuffed full of wood warblers. And even if you can see there with the atlas, there were plenty of them still. Look at, there was plenty of green there. Okay, there was red appearing. Notice it's around the edge of the New Forest, not in the middle. But there are a number of things going on, and one of the things is that wood warblers pretty much arrive the same date that they always did. They have moved forward slightly, but not much. There's nothing really where they winter to indicate to them that they should move to Britain quicker. And of course, when they arrive and when they have chicks, they're looking for insects, they're looking for caterpillars in particular to feed their chicks on. And the caterpillar progress is so much more advanced now, probably 3 or 4 weeks. So by the time that the wood warbler needs caterpillars, those caterpillars are now moths. They're not going to get them. So we've noticed that wood warblers are really struggling to find food. They're having to feed their chicks on aphids, and you need a lot of aphids to make up for a juicy caterpillar. And one of the other problems is that quite often those chicks are calling at night. They're still hungry, they're wanting to be fed, and so they call from the nest at night rather than being quiet. And because of that, they're more noticeable to things like foxes. And we've had a nest also taken by tawny owl. So I'm afraid I think wood warblers not got a future. And I'm really ashamed to say that when we do get wood warblers nesting, birders are now as big a problem as anything else, because we have people who are obsessed about getting wood warbler on their year list, and they're not satisfied just to stand at a distance and listen. They have to go and stomp around where they're nesting. These poor wood warblers, it's a real struggle for them. So we're now having to fence nests to keep the birders out. I wished I wouldn't have to say that, but it is the truth. Another one, gosh, it's depressing this, willow tit, on the way out, probably gone. A wonderful bird, used to be quite widespread in Hampshire, but in the last atlas it was already disappearing. You can see, look at all that red, vanished from so many woods. And if you look at the BTO map on the right, just look at all those black triangles, places that they'd gone from. Well, the story behind willow tit is almost certainly going to be driven by climate. This is the map from the Climatic Atlas, which was produced about 15 or 20 years ago. And what it did was it took the existing distribution of birds at that time, and it made predictions about where those birds would be in 100 years' time if climate change carried on the way it looked like it was going to, with say a 3 degree change in temperature. Obviously, we're hoping it won't be 3 degrees, but look, let's just change the map. This is what they predicted. This is what they predicted for about 2100. So willow tits gone from southern England. I just go shuttle between those two. And you can see that they're still in Norway and they're in Sweden, which they like because they actually like cooler habitats. They don't like it warm. And this is very interesting. The only places where we had the last few of our willow tits was on the very highest woods, above 170 meters, which does indicate to me that they were looking for somewhere cooler to feed. Lesser redpoll. Now, of course, redpoll. Don't know what's happened with this bird. We don't have it breeding anymore. We used to, but you can see from the UK map, they are advancing northwards, very much more a northern bird now, and we've just pretty much lost all of them. In fact, you can see on our top map there, lost from 39 squares, gained in none. So gone, although probably not, probably somewhere there is a pair. But a bit of good news, finish off on some positives. Corn buntings we're noticing are on the way back in, and we have an increasing population of corn buntings, not shown on this map, but since the last atlas, we've seen many more corn buntings, and in fact, corn buntings in places where they never were before. So that is really encouraging. So why is that? It could be because of the use of some methods to try and get corn buntings to nest successfully. So if you can put a double density of crop into the middle of a field rather than around the edge, which happens accidentally when the tractor crosses over areas it's been on before, if you put the double density in a few spurts in the middle of the field, the corn buntings will go and nest there. Now, if they nest in the middle of a field, they're going to be further away from predators like weasels and foxes and also sparrowhawks. And they are more successful if they nest away from hedgerows. So that's a good news story. More farmers are doing that. Not many, I'm afraid, but the more that do it, the better for the corn bunting. And look, you know, Firecrest. I know you've got Firecrests. We have them. We had the first ones, 1961 in the New Forest, very first pair. I mean, this is out of date already, I think. I've put 2,000 plus pairs in Hampshire. Well, 2,000 pairs was the national population estimate about 5 years ago. Obviously, that was wrong. We already, as far as I could see, had about 2,000 pairs. I've got woods I go in where there is a firecrest singing every 100 meters. And it's a wood that's, you know, 5 miles square. And the wood has probably got 200 pairs in it itself. So yeah, this is a bird that's definitely here and getting more common. And I think when we look at the next BTO atlas, the map will show a very different story indeed. We're also really lucky to have hawfinches in good numbers. We don't really know what the number is. I mean, 450 to 500 pairs was an estimate that we put together based on sightings, but you know, they're such a secretive bird. They call very high pitched, so you don't necessarily hear them unless you've got really good hearing. But just based on winter roosts and spring roosts, we know there must be that sort of number in the New Forest, and it is the New Forest they go to mainly. There are only a few places in Britain where hawfinches do well. We're one of them. Forest of Dean's another, and other places in North Wales and Lancashire. And as you can see from this map, the New Forest has the bulk of them. They're very hard to find elsewhere, they really are. But there we've got over 35 roosts, so we've got a good way of monitoring them and keeping an idea on numbers. And I don't know if you watched the One Show, but I was on the One Show earlier this year talking about woodpeckers with Mike Dilger. We've got between 200 and 250 pairs of lesser spotted woodpeckers, almost all of them in the New Forest. So if you haven't seen a lesser spotted woodpecker for a while, I know it's a long way to go, come down to the New Forest in February, and in the early morning, probably before 9 a.m. to be honest, so stay overnight, good chance of hearing lesser spotted woodpecker drumming at one of the well-known drumming spots. We're lucky to have them. They're long-lived birds. I don't think they're finding it easy. I think, like the wood warbler, they're struggling to find food at the right time for their chicks. If only they could nest a little bit earlier, they would do better. Maybe they will learn over time. And there's the map showing you where they are, mainly in the New Forest, also dotted around in some other woods. And we're doing some work this coming spring where we've bought some audio recorders which are programmed to listen for particular species. Well, the software is anyway. So we're listening out for hawfinch and lesser spotted woodpecker, and the BTO is doing all the analysis. And we're going to put these recorders in different woods to see if we can detect these birds, places where they used to be and we haven't seen them since. And, we now have almost 1,000 pairs of Dartford warblers. And we've had a number of quite mild winters, so they're doing well. And they're not just in the New Forest, they're actually around on a number of other heaths all over the place. You can see they're really only in the south and southwest, but here they are. There's the Thames Basin heaths up the very top, northeast part of Hampshire, the Wealden heaths a bit lower, and then we've got the New Forest and also coastal strip. But there have never been more Dartford warblers in Hampshire than we've got right now. Well, there are going to be some, I think, that's going to move in. I've already indicated that it's about time great white egrets started nesting. But we've got cranes nesting in Wiltshire. And of course, there's a release program in the southwest, so they may reach us. We've got bitterns at a higher level than at any time in my life, thanks to work by the RSPB and others on some of the marshes in Britain. And we've got white storks, although artificially, being released in Sussex from birds taken from, well, released birds from coming in from Poland. So I guess we're going to get all of these in my lifetime. Whether they're in the next 5 years, I don't know. If I had to put my money on it, my money would go on great white egret. I think that's the next one. But I'd be interested to know what you think. Thank you very much for listening. I've had photographs in this talk. Not all of them I took. Some of them I did, but a lot of them I didn't, if I'm honest. And I want to thank my friends who supplied those. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will invite you to ask any questions on anything to do with birds in Hampshire, or frankly, anything about birds, if you happen to have it on your mind and want to see if I've got an opinion.
Thank you, Keith. That was fascinating. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. I've got a question with you to kick off, and that's about the lesser spotted woodpeckers. Actually, we've heard that they've not had a lot of success with breeding this year in the UK. Have you seen a similar picture in Hampshire, or has your population done better?
I don't know what the figures show for this year. The work on these have been done by Ken and Linda Smith, who are based in Sussex, and they come in and do an awful lot of work in Hampshire. But there are not many nests found. And those nests that they have found, they've very often found that the adults are having real trouble bringing in enough food. They've put cameras up to try and see what food is being delivered. There are some discussions about whether we should actually provide supplementary food for them with sort of maggots near to the nest, which is something we're looking at. But that's quite a big job. I mean, if you've got 250 pairs, you're not going to be able to supply maggots to 250 pairs of lesser spotted woodpeckers.
No, absolutely. I suppose you've also got to look at the longer term strategy of you can supplementary feed, but at what point do you stop?
The thing they need to do is they need to learn that if they nested earlier, they would actually have a good supply of food.
Yeah.
And of course, evolution dictates that the ones that do that will do it and succeed, and will pass their genes on to other birds that will also do that. But that takes hundreds of years, and we may not have hundreds of years for that bird.
No, absolutely. And as you said earlier, we've seen moths appearing and butterflies appearing earlier this year, and also some relatively late.
Yeah.
So climate change has clearly got a role in this. I've got some questions here. So first of all, observation from Richard Chew. He said, "Thank you, Keith. Very interesting talk on an area he doesn't know very well, but he's more familiar with the county next door that begins with a D." He's also asking, what's the status of spotted flycatcher and common redstart in Hampshire?
Well, spotted flycatcher is one I think that is much more common than we realise. So I have to wear hearing aids. I'm 64 and I wear hearing aids because I have tinnitus. And when I've got hearing aids in, I can just about pick up spotted flycatchers.
Right.
But
Yeah.
there are a lot of bird watchers who should be wearing hearing aids and don't.
Yes, I'm
And
one of them.
you, yeah, well, you know, when you look at three species, firecrest, tree creeper, and spotted flycatcher, all
Yes.
of them under recorded in the last atlas.
Yeah.
And the BTO definitely looked at this and thought, well, maybe that is something to do with people's hearing. You know, most of the people who've got time to go out and do bird surveying are of the same sort of age as us,
Yes.
and therefore we've got to think about that. So this may be one of those areas where remote sampling of
Hmm.
sounds will help. I mean, I can't hear hawfinches to save my life, um, but an acoustic device would hear them,
Yeah.
and we are now looking at using them. They're quite cheap, some of them. You can pay as much as you like. You could pay £400 or you can pay £50. So worth having a look at. I think that, you know, the society should have a look at that and see what you think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll happily share details.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
And the important thing is the BTO is going to do all the analysis of our recordings. And in fact, we have given a grant to the BTO of several £1000s so that they have got payment for staff time to analyze our recordings.
Brilliant. Very good. Richard's also asking about the state of ospreys. Is there a presence or a potential colonisation in
Sure.
Poole
And
Harbour?
he asked about red start as well, and I didn't
Oh,
answer
yeah,
that.
sorry.
So red starts are only really in the New Forest, but they're doing well. There's lots of nice old woodland there, what I would call wood pasture,
Hmm.
and estimates vary. There's at least 500 pairs, but quite possibly as many as 1,000 pairs of red starts. So they're doing well there. And we're doing quite a lot of work on those too, with cameras going into nests and seeing success rates on chicks. Uh, the type of camera you put down your throat. Can't remember the name of it now, but you know the sort
Yeah.
of thing I mean. Ospreys, well, the ones from Dorset and elsewhere pass over. We see so many ospreys these days. We've got some osprey platforms up. Um, I didn't really ever think they would nest, but I do think that now they've been born in Dorset, those birds will come back to Dorset and nearby and think about that as a place to nest. And I think when that happens, we're in for a good chance. So we're actually dusting down our existing Osprey platforms and making sure they're fit for purpose, because one or two of them, frankly, are not. And we'll see if we can be ready for when they arrive.
Brilliant. Thank you. What else have we got here? Um, John Fell's asking, how are the little terns doing at Lower Pennington?
Well, little terns have not done too well generally, but at Lower Pennington they did do quite well this year. They've got little air raid shelters for them to go under. So every year is different. Some years they do badly. Depends on where they nest, really. But they did pretty well this year, if I recall. I don't have any numbers on that, but better than recent years.
Encouraging.
Excuse me.
Encouraging, though. Um, okay, so we get a question here about raptor persecution. And bearing in mind the number of white-tailed eagles, goshawks, and honey buzzards that you have in your county, is the persecution as serious in Hampshire as it is as we see it is in certain parts of northern England?
No, it's not as bad. So the majority of farmers and gamekeepers in Hampshire are uh, law abiding. They probably don't like birds of prey, if we're honest, but they don't act on it. I think there's probably a fair amount of persecution of goshawks. Certainly, I've come across woods which have had goshawks in and have been nesting, and then a month later they've gone completely.
Right.
So, and those are usually on keepered estates where, unfortunately, these birds seem to nest right next to the pheasant pens. So it's not surprising that the gamekeepers get rid of them. Quite often in that situation, I can't really make an issue about it because I was probably trespassing in the first place to actually be
Right.
aware of those birds.
Okay.
To take it wider, I'm not aware of any persecution of honey buzzards. We've had a few kites killed, um, and I've definitely had cases where rat poison has been used. It seems to be as big a problem maybe just over in Dorset Perhaps that's where there are some very large estates in Dorset, with quite heavily keepered. And I think we don't have such large estates in Hampshire, and the mindset maybe is slightly different. We also have a larger rural wildlife crime team. So, and lots of birders, 2,000 birders out there in Hampshire. So if anything dies, a good chance we'll find it.
And how active is your relationship as with HOS with the wildlife crime team in your county?
We have an incredibly good relationship. I write an article for they have a quarterly magazine. I have an article in it every single issue about an aspect of wildlife crime and birds. We meet up. I run training courses for them to help them identify and understand Schedule 1 birds and what they need to do. If there's a problem, they give me a call straight away. So it's a really good relationship. It takes time. You've got to work at it. And of course, people at the top change regularly in the police, and you only need the 2 or 3 top people at the top to change, and you've got to go in and meet them, and they just need to trust you. And I think they trust me in knowing that I'm there to help them enforce the law, not going to be on their back telling them they're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
And if they are doing it wrong, I have a quiet word.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely the right way to go about it as well. Unfortunately, in Essex, we have a rural engagement team, as they call them, but there's actually only one wildlife crime officer within that team. So he's pulled from pillar to post because we're quite a large county.
Well, there is a county not far from Hampshire where I did get involved with some peregrines that were nesting on a building, which was about to have window cleaners go down in buckets to right by the nest site. And I did explain to the owner of the building that they were about to break the law. And I had a call from the sergeant in that team saying to me, exactly what role was I doing that as? And I said, well, I'm the license holder, for Schedule 1 license holder, albeit for Hampshire, not the county I was talking about. And he said, well, don't get carried away with your role. And I said, okay, well, look, I'm telling you a crime is going to be committed. If it's committed and those birds fail, I'll make sure your name's all over the local newspaper. You won't forget this conversation. And he noted that and he took action. So you do have to be firm with people, but you actually also have to work out. I start on the basis that we're all going to be good friends and I'm going to help you. And, I'll tell you a phrase here. I'm like a skunk. If I piss on you, you're going to smell a long time. So learn that early and we'll get on fine.
Okay, we've still got a few more questions that are rolling in here. So we've got a question from Colin. He's not making any judgments, but you suggested that Egyptian geese are unwelcome, and he's wondering why. I mean, I think you mentioned flocks of 100. We don't tend to get flocks of 100 here in Essex.
Yeah, well, there are flocks of 100. I think they're just becoming like Canada geese are already. I mean, not too many fan clubs of Canada geese, but you know what? I have made that comment before, and I've had a bit of pushback from people who've said to me, I think they're lovely. They're pretty. Well, I think they're pretty ugly, but they're noisy and there are too many of them in some areas, and I think they do squeeze out some other nesting birds, but I don't think they're going away. So if you like Egyptian geese, you're going to have a good time.
Brilliant, thank you. So another question, let me just read this through. All right, okay. So appreciating this is a talk about birds, but I think it goes well with the discussion about predation as well. And that is that someone says they heard a talk recently by Chris Packham where he was talking about pine martins, and just asking, you've actually got pine martins in your county, and how's that impacting on the nesting birds?
So we do have pine martins in the New Forest. They will almost certainly have been released at some point over time. I think they've done some DNA work on them and found out that they were from like Central European stock or whatever. They weren't, for example, from Scotland. Well, I imagine they will have an impact because pine martins will feed on nesting birds. But I imagine they're probably never going to get to the kind of levels where, like foxes have, where they are incredibly common. But we'll have to see. you know, foxes are a problem for us, and there's a lot of work being done on fox diet in Hampshire. So foxes are a major predator of curlews, and we have about 35 pairs of curlews. I didn't talk about them, but and when you analyze the stomach contents of foxes, you find that they are eating so much human food, pizza, hamburger, cat food, lots of people feeding foxes. And these foxes then go out into the New Forest and also start feeding on the curlew chicks and eggs. So we could do with fewer foxes, to be honest. I'm worried more about them than pine martens.
Whilst we was talking about our four-legged friends, you mentioned about otters earlier and the impact that they have on the avocet colonies. Are the otters on the increase in Hampshire, and is it worrying numbers, or is it controlled at the moment?
Well, I wouldn't say it's worrying numbers, but they are increasing. They're on most of the rivers now. And certainly if you put up trail cameras, you spot them quite quickly. And what we have to do is we have to put fencing around our avocet colonies. Without a fence, the avocets won't succeed because the foxes will get them, and if the foxes don't get them, it'll be the otters.
Yeah.
So fencing is the answer.
Let's see if we've got any other questions here. No, I think the questions have dried up. Let me just double check that. No, it looks like that's all the questions for this evening. So Keith, just to say thank you very much again. Very, very interesting talk. I mean, I've been to Hampshire a few times, been over bird watching, but I was totally unaware of the bird life, and certainly some of the rarer birds that you have in good quantities in your county. It sounds like the New Forest is a fantastic environment for them.
I'd certainly encourage you to come down and have a look at the New Forest, make a weekend of it. We've got some good nature reserves around the edge of the forest, and the forest itself is really good. And you know, 15 million people go to the New Forest every year, so another 10 or so won't matter.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you very much. Very much
Thank you.
appreciated. We'll speak soon. Thank you.